the first decision you have to make is whether you want things to be better or worse. And it seems to me that better is a better aim. And if that's what you want, then you can orient yourself to becoming fully on board with that. That's your motif. And I would say that's love in the religious sense, is that love is the desire that all things flourish. And you might think that's evident. It's like, it's not evident. This is hard because things are difficult. It's easy to become spiteful and bitter and resentful, and to be self-denigrating and not to work for your own furtherance because you're ashamed of who you are, like deeply ashamed, maybe even ashamed to be human. The destructive species that we are, constantly raping the planet, that self-loathing can go very, very deep. So this is hard. But that's the first thing. Do you want things to be better or worse for you and for the people around you? It's like, well, so that's your goal, to make them better. Perhaps that's your goal. When I was a clinician, that's what I was always working on with my clients. It was like, I'm on the side of you that's aimed at making things better. No unconditional positive regard, because there's going to be parts of you that are working at counter purposes to that, and we're not on their side. They're to be judged and dispensed with, not in a contemptuous or dismissive manner, but with the knowledge that those elements of your personality are not serving the goal. And that doesn't mean that might be bringing them on board. So if you're aggressive, that can serve the good. That can make you persistent and committed and immovable, all those things. And then the next thing I would say is, watch for resentment, arrogance, and deceit. They're your enemies. And see if you can reduce the influence they have over your life. And then that's where you have to watch and feel, am I lying? Is this self-serving? Is what I'm saying making me weak? Can I feel that? Am I insisting that I'm right? Because I'd rather believe that I was right than learn. Am I taking revenge in a resentful way? Those are good questions of conscience. It's highly probable that you're doing that in many places. Maybe you can dispense with that carefully over time and see what happens. So it's worth running the experiment.
Yeah. And putting our everything into it, because that's where we'll really learn, by giving that endeavor.
Well, that's
towards
a good
our
aim. It's a good aim, but you can start with even a little couple of percents of you aim towards that. You can start badly. And that's a useful thing to know too, is like, you can improve your life a little bit at a time. And it's very difficult to be all in. We talked about that earlier. Who knows who you could be if you were everything you could be? That is a limitless case. What would it be like if you stopped doing all the stupid things that you're doing and took advantage of all the opportunities that came your way and aimed at the highest good? Who knows what you could be? You could certainly be more than you are. Everyone knows that, I think, and everyone suffers that knowledge. It's from that their feelings of inadequacy spring. That can be pathologized too. I know people can be way harder on themselves than is actually good for them. That's not what I mean. It's hard to distinguish between those even, but it can be done, I think.
What can you be? And that's inspiring. That's a story that's going to be told and lived out in this life. And everybody who watches you live that story will be inspired by that, because they'll be inspired to live their own story. And that's, I think, the most important message is, live as the hero, and allow that to be, the fable that has grandchildren saying, I'm going to be whoever your name is, I'm going to be this person because you lived in such an inspiring way. And that's what draws me forward, and I think draws all the heroes forward of our time, and that's what we need right now.
And that isn't done at someone's expense.
Yeah.
Not if it's done right. It's done with the benefit of everyone else in mind. And that's a case I try to make in the book too. Like if you're acting in your own self-interest, because you're a community that stretches across time, you have to take your own future self into account constantly. And so impulsive selfishness is not useful, even selfishly. And so you can make the most out of yourself, I believe, without taking anything away from anyone else. It's only beneficial. Now, people might be annoyed at you because you're more successful on some dimension than they are, and perhaps that hurts, but, well, if to deal with that, we'd have to eradicate the possibility of ever being better at anyone ever being better than anyone else at anything. And it doesn't seem to me that we want to push equality that far. Yes, and I think at the darkest edges of the demand for equality have that horror at their root. It's like, well, you're going to take away from everyone what they have to offer by insisting that everything is equal. It's like, no, you want people to be able to trade the best they have with other people. That's a good deal for everyone. Every ideal is a judge. And that makes perfect sense, because an ideal is something to which you aspire. And the gap between you and that ideal, if it's your ideal, is felt as judgment. And so that's one of the reasons people are very afraid to have an ideal, to make it. That's why I wrote, do not hide things in the fog. It's like, well, you should lay out an ideal. You should pursue an ideal. Why wouldn't you? Well, when you make your ideal explicit, it turns into your judge. Well, then you can listen to that judge and move forward and transform. But, it's pretty damn harsh. Because especially to begin with, you posit an ideal, especially if you're in a mess. God, every bit of you is being judged as unworthy. Yeah. There's endless reasons not to want that.
The mercy comes from saying, this is the ideal, but the expectation of judgment that I'm going to be at that right away is false. So let me appreciate myself right here where I am in this journey with all of my faults, however many they are, open up my entire closet of internal monsters, pet them on the head and say, okay, here we go, eliminating more of those and becoming more like the ideal, surrendering to the journey rather than that expectation. And there, the judge no longer carries the sting and the bite and the harshness, because you're judging yourself according to a timeline where you're hoping to get closer to this.
Yes, well, and the hallmark starts to become improvement.
Right.
It's exactly. Like, and that's great. That's a really sustaining, sustaining process too, because technically speaking, again, seeing yourself move towards a desired goal is the essence of the positive emotion that nourishes us. And I mean that technically. That's dopaminergically mediated incentive reward. And so you don't have to get to the goal. You have to aspire to the goal and move towards it. And that doesn't even matter if the goal recedes, which it will as you approach it, because your ability to conjure up what constitutes the ideal is going to become more sophisticated as you move towards it. And you might think, well, that's terrible, but it isn't, because it means the game doesn't have to end. Right? Because if you hit the ideal,
yes.
It's like, oh, well, game over, reset, but no, that isn't going to be how it works. It's going to get better. Better. And
it's why life is the perfect game. I mean, if you have for those of us who've played video games, you have a really good video game, or even a really good book, or even a really good movie series or a show, and it comes to the end and you're like, there's a huge letdown at the termination of this thing that's been incredibly engaging, especially
even if you win.
Yeah, exactly. You win and you get this moment's satisfaction, but it's replaced almost immediately by the disappointment of the cessation of the game and the recognition that you're in a finite game when you really want to be playing the infinite game. And that's what life is, the infinite game of renewal of life. And that's why it's so good. We'll never replace it. It can't get better. And it's hard as hell. And it's hard as hell at the same time. And that's the way we would want it.
Well, it seems like that's the way we want it. I mean, that's another thing I talk about a little bit in the new book is like, well, when you look back on your past, it's generally having done something difficult that you remember positively, I would say. I'm in terrible pain almost all the time. And I do mean terrible. If in my previous life, when I was healthy, I had ever felt like I always feel now, I would have immediately gone to the emergency ward. But it's not helpful. As far as I can tell, as far as I've been informed for that matter, there isn't anything that can be done about the condition that I'm in. And that's rough. I have to remind myself all the time of what I should be doing, even to continue living for that matter. And I'm constantly reminding myself to be grateful as an act of courage. And I do explain that a little bit in Beyond Order. Something I really realized about gratitude is that gratitude at one level is it's a voluntary act of courage. And I'm not trying to make out a case for myself being particularly courageous. That isn't what I mean. I mean that it's a risk to be grateful. It's a decision that opens you up in some ways. And you're sort of grateful despite it all. It's a great gratitude, I suppose, as a marker of faith. And that faith is even, in some sense, belief in the impossible. Despite all this, it's good. And I have to remind myself of that all the time. And I do that with prayer. I mean, I say grace with my wife. We only share one meal together, but we always say grace. And I actually think in some sense, that's a really good part of my day, the time we do that. And that comes as somewhat of a surprise. And it's a relatively recent practice for the two of us. Not that we weren't trying to be grateful before, but we've both gone through our respective hells in the last 2 years. Because my wife had a very terrible cancer. It was terrible, and terrible surgical complications. And she was on death's doorstep for months and months and months. And in any case, we remind ourselves constantly to be grateful. And I'm always trying to watch what I say and to feel it out so that I use my words carefully.